All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. So today we're going to move on now and take a look at respiratory disease. So diseases of the respiratory system, chapter 19. Now you might remember from an anatomy class or a general biology class that you've had that the respiratory system is mainly made up of a series of finer and finer tubes. So anytime you have tubes or openings like that, that's going to be potential for infection in those tubes and those openings. So let's start with infections of the upper respiratory tract. Now, these include anything upper respiratory. So the nose, throat, auditory tubes, eustachian tubes, middle ears, the larynx, the voice box, things like that. So anything up here, okay? Not in the lower respiratory tract, anything upper. Now, the good news is infections here are generally less severe than if we get into the lungs and into the air sacs in the lungs, the alveoli, lower down, okay? Remember, in the upper respiratory tract, you have abundant normal microbiota. So the oral cavity, the nose in particular. All right. So conditions could include anything here: pharyngitis, laryngitis, tonsillitis, sinusitis. Remember, everyone, itis, that ending itis, meaning inflammation of. So inflammation of the pharynx, that's the back of the throat. The larynx, often including the vocal cords. The tonsils, the sinuses. Okay? So again, anything in the upper respiratory tract. Now, generally those aren't that problematic. They're less severe. One exception to that is epiglottitis. You might remember from your anatomy that the epiglottis, pictured right here, is a flap of tissue that folds over the glottis, which is the opening into the trachea or your windpipe when you swallow. So when you swallow, the epiglottis covers the glottis, or opening into your windpipe, so food goes down the esophagus and not into your lungs. All right, if that becomes inflamed, the epiglottis, notice here, it's right in the back of the throat, right in the pharynx there. This is very rapidly developing and can lead to death within a few hours, because when that's inflamed, that inflammation, it's going to cut off your ability to breathe. Now, epiglottitis is often caused by a virus, Haemophilus influenza type B virus, okay? Now, HIB here also causes meningitis, an inflammation of the meninges, or the covering, the tissue that covers the brain and spinal cord. So a vaccine is required to avoid this. Now here we see the problem here. Here's looking down. This is a normal epiglottis here, okay, and one infected with with that Haemophilus influenza leading to epiglottitis. See the breathing tube here. So this can be a very dangerous situation. All right. Now, the common cold we have to mention here. The common cold is the most prevalent disease in humans, by far. All right? The issue is it's caused by more than 200 viruses in several different families. The most common, though, are rhinoviruses and coronaviruses are the most common. Up to 30% of cold viruses were previously unknown. They mutate very, very rapidly. Now, interestingly, but not surprisingly, these viruses thrive, they do really well at a temperature that's slightly lower than body temperature. Wouldn't that be what's similar to the upper respiratory system? Your mouth, your nose, okay? That's very close to the outside environment. So it's going to be a little cooler than the internal body temperature. People do tend to accumulate immunity as we age. We tend to get less colds as we get older. Okay? Now, what about infections of the lower respiratory tract? Now, these tend to be more dangerous, more serious. So this would be infections in the trachea, the windpipe, the bronchi, the branches off the trachea that go to the lungs, and then even the air sacs in the lungs called the alveoli, where gas exchange occurs. Now, you may recall that the lungs are an organ, so these tissues should be free of normal microbiota. And your body does have mechanisms that it uses to protect the lower respiratory tract. Two in particular, the ciliary escalator. That whole system there, trachea, bronchi, into the alveoli, is lined with mucous membranes that contain cilia, little tiny hairs that can be used to trap particulate matter, including microbes. So these mucous membranes with cilia line the trachea and the bronchi all the way down to the alveoli. And they trap not only microbes, but they can trap things like dust particles and other things like that from getting into the lungs proper, into those air sacs. We also, and this is what's shown here, that cilia there. We also have what are called alveolar macrophages, one pictured right here. Okay, these open spaces, those are an image of the alveoli in your lungs, little air sacs where oxygen and CO2 are exchanged. This macrophage is a white blood cell. They're located in the alveoli themselves, and they patrol. So any microorganism that gets there is phagocytized and presumably destroyed. All right? Okay, now of particular importance when we talk about the lower respiratory tract infections is pneumonia. All right? Pneumonia, everyone, and this is important, is inflammation of the lungs, so all the tubes in the lungs, the air sacs in the lungs, the alveoli, and or the bronchioles, which are the smallest tubes that lead into the alveoli. This inflammation causes any of those things here to fill with fluid. All right? Now, pneumonia results in 4 million deaths per year worldwide, typically as a secondary infection. Okay? Now, notice I put pneumonia here in quotes. Pneumonia is a general term. We have to further characterize it, further describe it by looking at three things. One, what part of the lungs are infected? Okay? So, for example, we could have a lobar pneumonia where a lobe of the lungs is infected. So what part of the lungs is infected? Number two, what organism is causing the infection? Pneumonia can be caused by bacteria, viruses, or fungi. Okay? And then lastly, we characterize it by how the pneumonia was acquired. How did you get it? How did your patient get it? For example, we could have ventilator-associated pneumonia, VAP. It's picked up from a ventilator. Healthcare-associated, nosocomial. All right? Now, of these three types of pneumonia here, bacterial pneumonia is the most common. It's also more severe than viral. Viral's the least severe of the three. Now, within bacterial pneumonia, the most common of that is called pneumococcal pneumonia. This is a type of bacterial pneumonia, and about 85%, so the vast majority of bacterial pneumonia is pneumococcal pneumonia. It is caused by this species, Streptococcus pneumonia. Okay? Now, interestingly, Streptococcus pneumonia is found in 75% of healthy people. It's part of your normal flora. Okay? It's kept in check by mechanisms we talked about earlier. All right? But it can be frequently a secondary infection. All right? Another type of pneumonia you may have heard of is walking pneumonia. This is formally called mycoplasma pneumonia. And this is the leading cause of pneumonia in children and young adults. Okay, not overall the leading type, but in children and young adults. Relatively mild system, but a nasty persistent cough. I've had that, and I can vouch for that. It can be difficult to diagnose because the cells grow very slowly in culture, the bacteria, the mycoplasma, and the cells are very, very small, 0.1 micrometer to 0.8 micrometer. Remember, most bacteria, most prokaryotes are 1 micrometer. This is quite a bit smaller. So here's that mycoplasma bacteria that causes walking pneumonia, chest x-ray. All right, now the last one I want to talk about for a disease of the lower respiratory tract is tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis, and you can see it here, the little stained cells here. Now, this bacterial species invades and then begins to grow. Its population grows in the air sacs in the lungs, the alveoli in the lungs. For much of human history, between the 7th and 19th centuries, because that's the 600s to the 1800s, long time, it caused up to 30% of all deaths, and it was known as consumption because it would lead to severe weight loss. All right? Now, the good news is that most infections of this Mycobacterium tuberculosis are asymptomatic. So you're going to be infected but not diseased. This is called latent tuberculosis. And it's thought that at least 1/3 of the world's population is likely infected in this latent form. So usually it's asymptomatic. But in about 10% of these latent cases, the disease does progress to an active state. Okay? So again, most of these are from reactivated latent infections. You might get initially infected and then it automatically goes to an active stage. But usually it's latent that becomes reactivated for some reason. Okay? If left untreated, it's about a 50% mortality rate. And today, upwards of 1.6 million deaths per year is still attributed to tuberculosis. And tuberculosis, everyone, may be the world's #1 killer for infectious disease. #1 killing infectious disease ever, because it still kills a lot of people today. An interesting thing about the Mycobacterium cells is that they are what we call acid fast, meaning that they don't stain very well. They resist normal gram staining and other staining techniques, and they have a very waxy cell wall. So because of that, it keeps the inside moist, and they can survive for weeks in dried spit or dried phlegm. All right? Also, interestingly, you can acquire tuberculosis by inhaling as few as 1 cell. It has a 20-hour generation time once in the body. So we're showing how we pick it up here. Okay. Parts of the world where tuberculosis is more or less common. Again, you can see here it's China and India where TB is most common. All right. Then we're going to look at the lighter shades here of orange or peach, and where it's not very common is the grays. So you see here, we're not quite in the gray, but not too common either. All right. This goes into a little bit more detail about tuberculosis. Here's that Mycobacterium tuberculosis, if you're interested. Let's talk a little bit about diagnosis. TB is typically diagnosed using what's called a tuberculin skin test, pictured here. And what this test is actually testing is not for the bacteria. It's testing to see whether your immune system has responded to TB. Now, let's say the test comes back positive. Does that mean you necessarily have TB? No. A positive test could mean a couple things. It could mean you do have TB, either active or latent. The test is going to come back positive. It could be that you had TB and then you recovered from it. Okay, and there's still antibodies and an immune response in there. Okay, T cells against it. Or maybe you had a vaccine against TB. All of those is going to cause a cellular immune response and a positive test. Chest x-rays are often used to confirm that diagnosis. And finally here, what about treatment? Good news is antibiotics have been used to treat TB pretty successfully since 1944, when Selman Waxman, who I mentioned in a previous chapter, discovered streptomycin. TB was something that is resistant to penicillin, but not to this drug, streptomycin. So this was discovered in 1944. Today, others are used mostly now. In an active infection, curing can take over 100 doses of multiple antibiotics for 6 months or more. Not necessarily an easy treatment. Sadly, everyone, and very scary, many strains of TB now are becoming antibiotic resistant. And they come in 2 flavors. You have MDR, multi-drug resistant strains. These are resistant to first-line antibiotics, including streptomycin, but still potentially vulnerable to other ones. The real scary one is the extensively drug-resistant, XDR strains. Those are resistant to at least 5 antibiotics. And that's a pretty scary thought. Now, if you look at this map here, what's interesting, like take North America here, Canada and the United States, and then also Europe over here, okay, and Australia here. These are industrialized nations. So the pie chart here is showing the what's the percent of cases of TB that are multi-drug resistant. So you see in industrialized nations, 33% of TB cases are multi-drug resistant. Now I know it's hard to see on the slide, but the little yellow in here, that's the percent that's extensively drug resistant. So that's 6% in industrialized nations. Go to like Eastern Europe and Western Asia over here. Okay, 35% multi-drug, 14% XDR. And then you get somewhere over here like Asia. Remember TB, much more common in India and China. 70% multi-drug resistant. Okay? All right, and then you can see other places here. All right? So that XDR and MDR are becoming more and more common. Now, you may not know this, but there is a vaccine against TB. It's called the Bacillus Calmette-Guerin vaccine, or BCG vaccine. It's given to over 70% of the world's population on a regular basis, but typically not given here in the U.S. because, as you see from the map, we have quite low incidence of TB. But in most other parts of the world, this is a vaccine that's given routinely, okay? Now, interestingly, the BCG vaccine is a little bit different from most other vaccines in that it doesn't protect you from the disease outright or almost exclusively. It reduces your risk by about 50%. I mean, I'll take that. That's better than being fully at risk. But it doesn't prevent near 100 like a lot of other vaccines. Okay? All right, everyone, that's a little bit shorter chapter. Again, this is not even close to exhaustive, but a little bit of an overview of infectious diseases of the respiratory system. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about diseases of the gastrointestinal system, so food and waterborne diseases, digestive system. Okay, until next time, everyone, have a good rest of the day, and we'll see you later. Bye-bye.